10 of the fantasy football season. And here's a few kickers I would start this week. The first guy, Ryan Suckup of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Suckup and the Bucks coming off a bye week here, trying to regroup and get back on the winning track. So Suckup, it's been a mixed bag of results for him this season. The last few weeks for him, week 6 at Philly, 4 fantasy points. Week 7 versus the Bears, 7 fantasy points. Week 8 at the Saints, 3. So this week here, it's a good matchup at the Washington football team, though, that gives up the 8th most fantasy points to kickers. And Suckup here, we know he's a pretty accurate kicker. The only down thing with him is, obviously, he's not going to kick 50-plus yard field goals, really. But he's on one of the top offenses in football. And at minimum, each and every week, he should be scoring 7 or more fantasy points. And I think this week, we're going to see 7 to 10 fantasy points from him. And he's a kicker I would start. The second kicker, Greg Joseph of the Minnesota Vikings. So Joseph should be owned in more fantasy leagues, in my opinion. He's only owned in 32% of fantasy leagues. But the last few weeks, he's been a fantasy machine at the kicking position. Week 5 versus the Lions, 17. Week 6 at the Panthers, 8. Week 8 versus Dallas, 11. And Week 9 at Baltimore, 7. So right here, he's another guy I could pencil in anywhere from 7 to 10 fantasy points. And this week, another good matchup at the Los Angeles Chargers here for Greg Joseph that give up the 6 most fantasy points to kickers. So right here, this Viking offense is a good offense, no doubt about it. They get many opportunities in the red zone. And Joseph, we know he's got a good boot where he could kick it from 50 yards or more. So in this one at the Chargers, I'd say 9 to 10 fantasy points is definitely a possibility. Kick is Matt Prater of the Arizona Cardinals. So Matt Prater, he's been pretty solid this season. And we know the Cardinals are one of the best teams in the league and obviously one of the best offenses in the league. But the last couple weeks, the numbers haven't been all that great for Prater. Week 7 versus Houston, 7 fantasy points. Week 8 versus Green Bay, 3 fantasy points. And Week 9 at the 49ers, 6 fantasy points. But right here in Week 10, Cardinals are back at home. Indoor game, obviously. And this Carolina Panther defense is a defense that bends but don't break. So I think Prater in this one will have a few opportunities to kick it through the uprights. And obviously, he'll get a lot of extra points as well with this great offense that he plays on. So right here, Prater gets back on track with a good ball game, in my opinion. The next kicker is Chris Boswell of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So it was surprising to me that he played in that ball game in Week 9 after taking a monster hit in Week 8 versus the Cleveland Browns. So right here, Boswell, 14 fantasy points in Week 9 versus the Chicago Bears. And he's a guy I usually don't have in my top 12 at the kicker position. But this week, he's up there for me because he's got a great matchup versus the Detroit Lions that give up the most fantasy points to kickers on the season. And right here, in my opinion, the Steelers, they're going to go up and down the field here versus the Lions. The Lions have proven this season that they're the worst team in pro football, still with no wins under their belt and with teams going up and down the field each and every week. So right here, I think Boswell at minimum gets 7 or 8 fantasy points. And once again, definitely could reach double digits. And the 5th and final kicker I have as a start this week is Brandon McManus of the Denver Broncos. So McManus here, we know he's got a good leg. We know he's a good kicker. And last week, he got back on track at the Dallas Cowboys with 10 fantasy points, even though he did miss an extra point and a 47-yarder in that game. But he still finished with a double-digit game. So right here in Week 10, it's a good matchup versus the Philadelphia Eagles. They're another defense that really don't stop anyone. And the Broncos are back at home where McManus is at his best kicking at Mile High Stadium. So in this ball game, 7 to 10 fantasy points I think he could get. And then he goes on by in Week 11. But this week here, he's definitely a kicker I would start. So that's a few kickers I would start for Week 10 of the fantasy football season.